Before we get into the video, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let's continue with the story. On the morning of April 18th, 1998, 8-year-old Daniel Harper disappeared from the front yard of his family's house in rural Indiana while waiting for the school bus. He had been standing less than 15 feet from the porch steps, backpack on, shoelaces half-tied, watching the road the way children do when they're afraid they might miss something important. His mother saw him through the kitchen window only seconds before she turned back to rinse a coffee mug. When she looked again, he was gone. No scream, no struggle, no open gate, just an empty patch of grass where her son had been standing moments earlier. 14 years would pass before anyone understood what really happened that morning. And when the truth finally came, it wouldn't come from a witness or a confession. It would come from something much smaller, something invisible, something buried quietly inside a lab freezer labeled unsolved. This is the story of Daniel Harper and the 14 years between disappearance and DNA. Maple Glen, Indiana, sat between two highways and a stretch of farmland that looked the same in every direction. Population just under 3,000. One grocery store, one diner, one stoplight that blinked yellow after dark. The kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and kids rode bikes until sunset. Where everyone recognized the same pickup trucks in the school parking lot. Where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen, until it did. The Harper house stood at the end of a gravel drive lined with cottonwood trees. A white, single-story place with a sagging fence and a rusted swing set that squeaked whenever the wind blew. Inside lived Karen Harper, 32, a nursing assistant who worked nights at the county hospital, and her two kids, Daniel and his older sister Megan. Daniel was small for his age, quiet, the kind of kid teachers described as gentle. Brown hair that never stayed flat. Big glasses he kept pushing up his nose. He liked dinosaurs and comic books and peanut butter sandwiches cut diagonally because he said they tasted better that way. Nothing about him stood out, which is what made what happened feel impossible. That Saturday morning had started like every other. Pancakes, cartoons, Megan arguing about homework she didn't want to finish, Karen moving slowly from lack of sleep, pouring cereal and signing permission slips at the same time. The bus normally came at 7:42. Daniel always waited outside early because he hated feeling rushed. At 7:36, he slipped his arms through his backpack straps and stepped onto the porch. Karen watched him through the window above the sink. Frost still clung to the grass. The air looked pale and cold. He stood near the mailbox, kicking gravel with the toe of his sneaker. There were no cars on the road, no neighbors outside, just open quiet. At 7:38, Karen turned to rinse her mug. The faucet ran for maybe 10 seconds. She dried her hands on a towel, looked back through the glass. The yard was empty. At first she thought he'd walked toward the side of the house, maybe chasing the cat, maybe checking the swing set. She called his name casually. No answer. She stepped onto the porch and scanned the yard. The backpack was gone. The mailbox stood still. The road stretched both directions without a single vehicle. She walked to the fence, checked behind the shed, looked under the porch steps. Nothing. The quiet started to feel wrong. Too heavy. Too still. If you've ever lost sight of your child for even a second in a store or a park, you know that cold drop in your stomach before logic catches up. Karen felt that drop and then something worse, because there was nowhere for him to be. At 7:44, the school bus arrived. The driver opened the door, looked around, and shrugged. "He's not coming today." Karen shook her head, already dialing 911. By 8:05, 2 deputies were walking the yard with notepads out. They measured distances. 15 feet from porch to mailbox, 22 to the fence. No broken boards. No footprints beyond Daniel's small ones in the frost. No tire tracks on the gravel. No strangers reported on the road. It didn't look like an abduction. It didn't look like a runaway. It didn't look like anything at all. It looked like a child who had simply stopped existing. By noon, volunteers filled the fields. Dogs traced the yard twice, then lost the scent near the driveway as if it had lifted straight into the air. Helicopters flew low over the tree line. Nothing. No shoe. No jacket. No sound. As the sun dipped behind the barns that evening, Karen sat on the porch steps staring at the place where Daniel had been standing that morning. The grass had already sprung back flat, like he'd never been there at all. And inside the house, his half-eaten pancake still sat on a plate at the kitchen table, cold and untouched, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. By late afternoon, the Harper driveway no longer looked like part of a quiet farmhouse. It looked like a command post. Patrol cars lined both sides of the gravel, their tires pressed deep into the dirt. Pickup trucks from volunteer firefighters filled the rest of the space. Radios crackled constantly. Strangers moved through the yard with clipboards and orange tape, marking sections that had already been searched. The swing set creaked every time someone brushed past it. The house lights stayed on even though the sun was still up. Everything felt brighter than it should have been. Too exposed. Too loud. Karen stood near the porch railing, answering the same questions over and over again, while Deputy Ellis wrote each answer carefully into a small spiral notebook. "What time did you last see him?" 7:38. "Anyone else home?" "No." "Any family disputes?" "No." "Anyone suspicious in the area recently?" "No." Each no sounded weaker than the last, like the word itself was dissolving. Megan sat inside at the kitchen table, hugging Daniel's backpack that the deputies had found in his bedroom closet, the spare one he used for sleepovers. She refused to let go of it. Every few minutes, she asked if they had found him yet. Karen kept saying soon. The deputies didn't say anything at all. At 4:12 p.m., a K-9 team from the neighboring county arrived. The handler placed one of Daniel's sneakers in a plastic bag, then let the dog sniff it. The dog moved slowly across the porch, then down into the yard, nose low, tail stiff. It followed a faint path toward the driveway. Then it stopped, circled twice, sniffed the air, sat down. The handler tried again from a different angle. Same result. The scent didn't fade gradually the way it normally would if a child had walked off. It simply ended, as if Daniel had stepped into something and disappeared. The handler didn't say that out loud. He just wrote something quietly on his form and handed it to the deputy. Karen watched his face and knew it wasn't good news. At 4:45, the sheriff arrived. Tall, gray-haired, slow-moving, the kind of man who had worked the same county for 30 years and rarely raised his voice. He took off his hat before walking up to Karen. "We're expanding the search," he said gently. "Fields, woods, ditches. We'll keep going until dark, then start again, at first light." She nodded like she understood, but the words didn't register. Expand the search meant they didn't think Daniel was nearby. It meant he was farther away than he should ever be. Volunteers formed lines across the soybean field behind the house, each person spaced about 8 feet apart. Step, look down, step, look down. The rhythm repeated for hours. Boots pressed patterns into the dirt. Someone called Daniel's name every few minutes. The sound carried across the open land and disappeared into nothing. The woods behind the property were searched next. Fallen leaves shifted loudly under every footstep. If a child had run through there would have been broken branches or small prints in the mud. They found none. No disturbed soil, no scraps of fabric, no candy wrappers. Nothing that suggested an 8-year-old had passed through. At 5:30, deputies began canvassing the road. They knocked on every door within a mile radius. Most neighbors had already left for work by 7:30 that morning. A few had been inside with televisions on. Nobody reported seeing a boy walking alone. Nobody remembered a strange car. The road was simply too quiet, too empty, the kind of road where something unusual should have stood out immediately. But nothing had. At 6:10, The bus driver returned to give her statement again. She confirmed she had slowed down at the Harper driveway at exactly 7:42. She had seen Karen standing on the porch alone. No child. No vehicle parked nearby. She had waited 10 seconds, then driven on. Her route log matched the time exactly. 10 seconds. The deputies circled that number twice. It kept coming back to the same window. Somewhere between 7:38 and 7:42, Daniel had vanished. 4 minutes. 4 minutes that no one could account for. As evening settled in, portable floodlights were set up near the porch. Generators hummed. The yard glowed white while everything beyond it turned black. From a distance, the house looked like a stage set, like something being examined under a microscope. Karen wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and refused to leave. Someone handed her coffee. She didn't drink it. She just kept staring at the mailbox. That was the last place she had seen him, kicking gravel, waiting for a bus. Normal. Safe. At 7:05, the sheriff finally called a pause for the night. "We'll resume at dawn," he said. "It's too dark to search safely." Volunteers nodded quietly, exhausted. Engines started one by one. Headlights faded down the road. Within 20 minutes, the yard was empty again, except for 2 patrol cars and the weak yellow porch light. The sudden quiet felt worse than the noise had. Inside the house, Daniel's room remained exactly the same. Bed unmade, comic book open on the floor, sneakers by the dresser. Megan placed the spare backpack on his chair like he might come back and grab it in the morning. Karen walked through each room slowly, touching things. His jacket, his toothbrush, the half-finished homework sheet on the desk, small evidence that he had existed that day. At 10:40 p.m., she sat on the couch and stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring, waiting for someone to say they'd found him wandering somewhere. Waiting for anything. Outside, the wind moved softly through the cottonwood trees. The mailbox creaked once, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence, the fields stretched quiet and endless, holding their secrets close, giving nothing back. The first 48 hours after Daniel Harper disappeared felt longer than any 2 days Karen had ever lived through. Time stopped behaving normally. Minutes stretched thin and brittle. Hours folded into each other until morning and night looked the same. The porch light never turned off. Neither did the kitchen light above the sink. She left both burning as if brightness alone could guide her son back home. By sunrise the next day, the driveway filled again with cruisers and volunteer trucks. The air smelled like wet grass and gasoline from generators that had run most of the night. Deputies set up the folding table by the mailbox once more, maps taped down at the corners. Coffee cups collected beside radios. Names were written on a sign-in sheet in black marker. The scene looked organized, almost calm, which made it feel wrong. Nothing about this should have looked calm. At 6:12 a.m., the second wave of search teams spread out beyond the original 2-mile perimeter. Woods farther north, a dried creek bed, an abandoned barn half a mile away that kids sometimes explored during summer. Each location was approached slowly, methodically. Flashlights first, then voices calling Daniel's name into the dark spaces. The barn smelled like rust and hay. Pigeons scattered when the doors opened. Deputies checked every stall and storage bin. Nothing. No footprints in the dust. No clothing. No sign that anyone had been there recently. The dogs were brought back out. This time they started from the porch steps again, working in tight circles like they were trying to catch something invisible. The same thing happened. The scent line moved toward the driveway, then stopped abruptly. Not faded, not confused. Stopped, one handler muttered quietly to another. Like he got picked up. He didn't realize Karen was close enough to hear. The words hit her harder than anything else that morning. Picked up meant someone had taken him. Someone had been close enough to touch him. Someone had stood in her yard without her knowing. If you've ever replayed a moment in your mind over and over, wondering what you missed, you understand what she felt then. She pictured the sink, the faucet, the 10 seconds her back had been turned. 10 seconds that now felt like a door she should never have closed. By 9 a.m., the FBI arrived. 2 agents in plain jackets stepped out of an unmarked sedan and walked straight to the command table. They didn't look dramatic or important the way movies made them look. They looked tired, like they had done this too many times before. One of them, Agent Collins, introduced himself gently and explained they specialized in missing children. He spoke slowly, carefully, like every word mattered. He asked Karen to sit inside the kitchen and go through the timeline again. Every detail. What Daniel had eaten, what he was wearing, whether he had argued with anyone, whether anyone had called the house recently. She answered everything. Blue hoodie, jeans, dinosaur lunchbox. No arguments, no calls. Normal. The word normal kept coming back, useless and hollow. Collins wrote notes, then asked one question that made her pause. Did Daniel know not to talk to strangers? Of course he did. Every parent taught their kids that. But Daniel was polite, quiet, the kind of child who would answer an adult if they spoke to him, who wouldn't want to be rude. Collins nodded like he'd expected that answer. By midday, Daniel's photo was on every local news channel. School picture, crooked smile, hair sticking up in the back. The caption read, "Missing. 8 years old. Last seen Maple Glen. Call this number with tips." Karen watched it on the small kitchen TV and felt like she was looking at someone else's life, like the photo belonged to another family. Strangers' voices saying her son's name. Around 1:30 p.m., calls started coming in. A boy matching the description seen near a gas station 40 miles south. Another at a rest stop off the highway. Deputies chased each lead fast and returned just as quickly. Wrong kid, wrong jacket, wrong hair. Every "not him" made the house quieter. Megan stopped asking questions. She sat on Daniel's bed, flipping through his comic books one by one like she was trying to memorize them. At 3 p.m., agents requested something new. They asked for Daniel's toothbrush, a hairbrush, anything with his DNA. Karen didn't understand at first. "For what?" Collins explained softly. "If we find something later, we'll need to compare." The word "later" echoed in the room. It sounded permanent, like they were already planning for years instead of days. She handed over the toothbrush with shaking hands. That night, the second search ended the same way the first had. Empty. The fields gave nothing back. The woods gave nothing back. The road stayed silent. By the third morning, fewer volunteers showed up. People had jobs, families. Life kept moving even when hers had stopped. The folding table looked smaller. The coffee ran out faster. Deputies spoke more quietly. The urgency had shifted into something else. Something slower, heavier. Investigation instead of rescue. Paperwork instead of shouting his name across fields. Inside the house, Daniel's pancake plate was finally thrown away. Karen couldn't look at it anymore, but the mark it left on the table stayed there, a faint circle in the wood, like a ghost of breakfast that would never be finished. And as the third night settled over Maple Glen, one truth began creeping into every conversation, every glance between officers, every quiet note written on a clipboard. Daniel Harper wasn't lost anymore. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't wandering the woods. Someone had taken him. And somewhere beyond the reach of dogs and helicopters and flashlights, that someone was still out there, carrying a secret the entire town didn't yet understand. By the end of the first week, the search for Daniel Harper stopped looking like a rescue and started looking like paperwork. The helicopters didn't come back. The volunteer lines grew thinner. The folding table by the mailbox disappeared first, then the extra cruisers. What remained were 2 deputies, a stack of forms, and a house that felt too quiet for a family that had once filled it with noise. Maple Glen slowly returned to normal the way small towns always do. The diner opened at 6. The grocery store stocked milk. School buses ran their routes. People still waved to each other at the intersection. Life kept moving forward with a kind of stubborn indifference that felt cruel to anyone standing still. Karen noticed it most in the mornings. At 7:38, the same time Daniel used to wait for the bus, the road outside stayed empty, except for the yellow flash of the bus slowing automatically at their driveway. Out of habit. The driver paused for 3 seconds, then kept going. Every day. Megan went back to school the following Monday. She didn't want to, but the counselor said routine helped. She wore Daniel's old hoodie even though it hung too big on her shoulders. At lunch, kids avoided sitting near her, not because they were mean, because they didn't know what to say. Teachers spoke gently, like she might break. She stopped raising her hand in class, stopped laughing. Karen returned to work at the hospital the next week because she didn't have a choice. Bills didn't stop. Rent didn't stop. The world didn't pause for missing children. Every shift felt unreal. She changed sheets and handed out medication and smiled at patients while somewhere in the back of her mind a single thought repeated over and over. My son is out there. The sheriff's office assigned one detective full-time to Daniel's case. Detective Mark Ellison, mid-40s. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who wrote everything down twice. He visited the house every few days with follow-up questions. Did Daniel ever mention anyone new? Any adults who talked to him? Any strange phone calls? Any vehicles that seemed unfamiliar? Karen kept saying no. The answers never changed. Daniel's life had been small and predictable. School, home, backyard. There wasn't room in it for strangers, which somehow made it worse. Ellison started building a timeline board at the station. Photos pinned with red string. Daniel's school picture in the center. The Harper house. The bus route. Every neighbor within a mile. He talked to registered offenders in surrounding counties. Checked truck drivers passing through that morning. Looked into custody disputes that didn't exist. Every path ended the same way. Nothing. No witness. No footage. No prints. No ransom call. It was as if Daniel had stepped into thin air. Weeks turned into months. Spring became summer. Grass grew tall behind the fence where search teams had once walked in straight lines. Kids rode bikes past the Harper driveway again. Life resumed its normal noise. Only Karen's house stayed quiet. Daniel's room remained untouched. Bed still unmade. A dinosaur drawing taped crookedly to the wall. His lunchbox still on the counter where she had packed it that morning. Peanut butter sandwich, wrapped in foil that had long since been thrown away but still existed in her mind exactly as it had been. Around month 4, the tips slowed down. At first, there had been dozens a day. Sightings, rumors. People convinced they'd seen him at malls or rest stops. Most turned out to be boys who just happened to be small with brown hair. After a while, the phone stopped ringing. News crews stopped calling. The photo at the grocery store bulletin board curled at the corners. A fresh one replaced it, then another. Seasons changed around that picture. Detective Ellison stopped by one afternoon with a manila envelope. Inside were dental records and Daniel's DNA profile from the toothbrush they'd taken. We keep these on file, he explained gently. If anything turns up later, we compare. Later again. That word that stretched into years. Karen nodded and pretended to understand. That night she lay awake, listening to the house settle. Every creak sounded like a door opening. Every passing car sounded like someone pulling into the driveway. She kept expecting a knock. A stranger holding Daniel's hand. Or worse, a deputy with his hat in his hands. If you've ever waited for news you're afraid to hear, you know that kind of sleeplessness. The body exhausted. The mind refusing to rest. By the first anniversary, the town held a candlelight vigil near the school playground. Balloons tied to the fence. A small banner with Daniel's photo. People prayed. spoke softly, promised they wouldn't forget. Karen thanked them even though she knew forgetting was exactly what would happen. Not out of cruelty, just time. Time erases everything, except for the parents. For them, nothing fades, nothing softens. Detective Ellison kept the file open, added notes every few months, rechecked old leads, compared unidentified remains from other counties. None matched. Each negative result went into the folder quietly, thin pieces of paper stacking up into something heavy. By year 2, Daniel's disappearance had a label, cold case. The phrase sounded clinical, harmless, like something stored in a refrigerator. But to Karen, it felt like a door closing. Cold meant they had stopped expecting answers. Cold meant Daniel existed mostly on paper now. Reports, numbers, dates. Not a boy with messy hair and a crooked smile. Just evidence. Just a file. And somewhere deep inside the sheriff's office evidence room, a small plastic tube containing Daniel Harper's DNA was sealed, labeled, and placed into a cardboard box with dozens of others. Quiet. Forgotten. Waiting. No one there could have known that 14 years later, that tiny sample would be the only voice Daniel had left to tell anyone what had really happened. Years have a way of softening everything except the things that matter most. In Maple Glen, Daniel Harper slowly became a story people told in past tense. Not intentionally, not cruelly, just naturally, the way small towns move forward because they have no other choice. New families moved in. The grocery store changed owners. The diner repainted its windows. Kids who had been in Daniel's 3rd grade class graduated high school and left for colleges 2 states away. Life layered itself on top of old memories until the edges blurred. But inside the Harper house, nothing blurred at all. Daniel's room stayed exactly the same. Karen never repainted it, never boxed up his clothes. His dinosaur lamp still sat crooked on the nightstand. His sneakers still rested by the dresser like he might walk in one afternoon and kick them off. Dust collected slowly, but she wiped it away every week. Like preserving a museum exhibit, like preserving proof he had existed. Megan grew taller, quieter. By 16, she barely spoke about her brother anymore. Not because she didn't think about him, but because it hurt too much to say his name out loud. She kept one photo of the 2 of them taped inside her locker at school. The edges were bent from being handled too often. Sometimes she caught herself trying to imagine what Daniel would look like now. Taller, maybe. Voice deeper. Maybe braces. Then she'd stop herself because imagining the future felt like admitting he might still be out there somewhere without them. Detective Ellison never closed the file. Every few months he'd pull it from the cabinet, flip through the same reports, stare at the same timeline. April 18th, 1998, 7:38 last sighting, 7:42 bus arrival. 4 minutes. 4 minutes that refused to explain themselves. He interviewed every new resident who moved into the county, rechecked old suspects, sent Daniel's dental records and DNA into national databases that had barely existed when the boy first vanished. Technology was changing faster now. New systems, new software, new ways to compare information. Most of the time, nothing came back. No match, no lead, just silence. But Ellison kept submitting the sample anyway. Hope, even thin hope, was still something. By 2005, the case file had grown thick enough to split into 2 binders. Paper had replaced people. Statements, maps, lab reports. Every page said the same thing in different language. No evidence, no witnesses, no direction of travel. Sometimes Ellison drove past the Harper house at night on patrol, just to check the porch light. It was always on. Karen still left it burning every single evening, like a lighthouse with no ships left to guide. If you've ever waited for someone who never comes home, you understand that kind of ritual. Small acts that don't make sense to anyone else but feel necessary to survive. Time kept moving. 8 years, 9, 10, Daniel would have been 18, then 20, old enough to vote, old enough to drive, old enough to have his own life. Karen started calculating his age automatically whenever she saw boys his height at the grocery store. 20 now. 21. She caught herself staring at strangers' faces, searching for something familiar. A nose shape, a way of walking, something that said, maybe. It never was. In 2012, nearly 14 years after Daniel vanished, something small changed inside the state crime lab 2 hours away in Indianapolis. Not dramatic, not urgent, just an upgrade. A new federal grant allowed them to retest old evidence using advanced DNA processing that hadn't existed in the late 90s. Back then, labs needed larger samples, clean samples. Now they could pull profiles from things barely visible. A drop, a skin cell, touch DNA from a piece of fabric. Technicians began reopening boxes labeled unsolved. Old envelopes, old swabs, old bags that had been sealed and forgotten. It was routine work, methodical, quiet. One afternoon, a young lab tech named Sarah Kim opened a cardboard box from Maple Glen County Sheriff's Office. Inside were items from Daniel Harper's case: a toothbrush, a comb, a sealed envelope marked "Yard Debris." The envelope contained something small that earlier investigators hadn't been able to test properly. A thin strip of duct tape found months after Daniel disappeared, stuck to weeds near the edge of the Harper property line. At the time, it had seemed random. Trash blown in from the road. They'd bagged it anyway, just in case. The original tests in 1998 had come back inconclusive. Not enough material. So the tape went into storage and stayed there for 14 years. Kim almost set it aside again. Almost. But the new equipment could work with less, much less. She clipped a tiny piece and ran the process overnight. She didn't expect anything. Most of these didn't produce results. The next morning, a notification popped up on her screen. Partial male profile recovered. She uploaded it into CODIS, the National DNA Database. Clicked Submit, then moved on to the next sample. Across the state, life continued normally. Cars moved down highways. Coffee brewed in office kitchens. Karen Harper folded laundry in her quiet house, the porch light still on even in daylight. She had no idea that in a sterile lab room miles away, a machine had just read something microscopic off a forgotten piece of tape. No idea that 14 years of silence had finally produced the first real voice in Daniel's case. And no idea that within hours, that voice was about to match someone who had never once been questioned. Someone who had lived less than 30 miles away the entire time. Someone whose name had never appeared in the file at all. The phone call came on a Thursday at 9, 12 inches the morning. Detective Ellison would remember the time for the rest of his life, not because anything about the hour was special, but because everything after it divided cleanly into before and after. Before, Daniel Harper was still just another cold case sitting in a gray cabinet. After, the case finally had a pulse. Ellison was halfway through paperwork at his desk when the desk phone rang, the old landline that almost nobody used anymore. Most updates came through email. When the crime lab called directly, it usually meant one of two things, either a mistake or something important. He picked up on the second ring. Ellison. "This is Sarah Kim with the state lab," the woman said. Her voice sounded calm, almost casual, like she didn't realize she was about to change someone's life. "We reran some old evidence from your 1,998 missing child file, Daniel Harper. We got a usable DNA profile." Ellison leaned back in his chair slowly. Usable wasn't the same as helpful. Lots of profiles led nowhere. "Okay," he said carefully. And a small pause, papers shuffling. It hit in CODIS. The room seemed to get quieter, not silent, just smaller, like the air had thinned. Hit how? Direct match to a convicted offender. State felony arrest in 2006. Names already flagged. We're sending you the report now. Ellison didn't speak for a second. 14 years. 14 years of nothing. And now a name. Send everything, he said. Right now. The email arrived 2 minutes later. He opened it with hands that didn't feel steady anymore. The lab report was clinical. Black text, charts, percentages. But the last line might as well have been written in red ink. Match confirmed. Jason Miller. Ellison stared at the name. He didn't recognize it. That bothered him. Every suspect from the original file had become familiar over the years. Neighbors, delivery drivers, registered offenders within 50 miles. He'd memorized them. Jason Miller wasn't one of them. Which meant something worse. It meant Daniel hadn't been taken by someone obvious. Not a known predator nearby. Not a stranger passing through town. It meant someone who'd never been on their radar at all. He pulled Miller's record. 38 years old now. Construction work. Arrested in 2006 for assault during a bar fight. Served 18 months. Standard felony processing. DNA taken at booking. That was the only reason they had his profile. No connection to Daniel's case. No interviews. No prior complaints. Just a man living 30 miles north of Maple Glen like nothing had ever happened. Ellison felt something settle heavy in his chest. 30 miles. That was it. Daniel hadn't been taken across state lines. Hadn't vanished into some distant city. For 14 years, the answer had been practically in their backyard. If you've ever realized how close you were to something you lost, you know that particular kind of anger. Not loud, not explosive, just cold and steady, the kind that makes your jaw tighten. Ellison printed the file and walked straight to the sheriff's office. No email, no delay. We got him, he said simply. They built the timeline fast. Miller would have been 24 in 1998, worked part-time landscaping back then. Contract jobs, private properties, farms, including, Ellison discovered, a seasonal job-clearing brush along County Road 12 the same spring Daniel disappeared, less than half a mile from the Harper house. He'd been there, not visiting, not suspicious, just another guy with tools and a truck. Invisible, the worst kind of person to miss. By afternoon, they had a warrant. 2 deputies and Ellison drove north in an unmarked sedan. The sky was gray and flat, threatening rain. The kind of day that made everything look drained of color. They didn't talk much. There wasn't anything to say. Either Miller explained everything, or he didn't. Either way, 14 years of questions were about to land on one front porch. His house was small. Single story. Beige siding. A truck parked crooked in the driveway. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed monster. Just ordinary. The scariest word in cases like this was always ordinary. Ellison knocked. Footsteps inside. A man opened the door halfway. Mid-30s. Broad shoulders. Tired eyes. The kind of face you'd pass at a gas station and forget immediately. Jason Miller. Yeah? Ellison held up the badge. We need to talk to you about something that happened in Maple Glen in 1998. The change was small, almost invisible, but it was there. A flicker, like a light turning on behind his eyes. That was a long time ago, Miller said. Ellison didn't blink. So was the DNA. We just pulled off evidence that matches you exactly. Silence stretched between them, heavy. Miller's hand tightened on the doorframe, just slightly. You're going to want to come with us, Ellison said. No sirens, no shouting, just quiet inevitability. Behind him, a neighbor watered her lawn, unaware history was catching up to the house next door. Back in Maple Glen, Karen Harper was washing dishes when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Almost. Something told her not to. She dried her hands and answered. Mrs. Harper, Ellison said gently. We may have found something. 14 years later, Those were the first words that didn't sound like sympathy. They sounded like truth. And for the first time since 1998, hope felt dangerous again. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.